Welcome. My name's Cliff Freilich. I'm the Executive Director of Cinema St. Louis, and we're the presenters of the 29th Annual Whitaker St. Louis International Film Festival. We're really pleased to have the director of the terrific documentary, The Place That Makes Me, join us for a conversation. Her name is Karla Murthy. Uh, and the person who's going to actually be handling the Q&A is a professor and actually chair of the Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies program. And she's also an affiliate professor of the American Culture Studies program at Washington U. And that's Rebecca Wanzo. So we really appreciate both of them taking the time out of their day to have a conversation. I'm now going to exit and turn things over to Rebecca.
Well, I'm really thrilled to be able to do this. As I mentioned to you in passing, Karla, I'm from Ohio. So I'm from Dayton, Ohio. So I've been really intrigued by this rise in, it seems to me, Ohio documentaries that I think have been taking place for the last few years. American Factory obviously has been the most prominent, but I'm curious about what made you focus on Youngstown. Why did you decide to do a documentary about Youngstown, Ohio?
So my day job is doing news reporting, and I actually get sent to Ohio a lot, and I've been there many times over the years. It's just one of those states, it's like in the bellwether of the United States, and
Mhm.
I've done everything from military to economic stories. And so in 2016, they sent me to Youngstown, Ohio. This was not even a story that I pitched, and they wanted me to look at the revitalization efforts going on there, and look at jobs. And it was an election year. How is this post-industrial town faring in an election year? And that's when I met some of the characters in my documentary. And I was first of all just struck by my own, I went to college in Ohio and I knew about Youngstown. And the only thing I really knew about Youngstown was that, it was a mafia town and lots of crime, and it was a steel mill town. That was basically
Mhm.
my only perceptions of Youngstown. And when I went there, I was immediately struck by actually the natural beauty there in the
Mhm.
town, which I just wasn't expecting. I mean, there's a waterfall in the middle of the city, and there's Mill Creek Park. And so that was one of the things I was struck by. But I was also, the revitalization efforts were being led by people, by residents who were from there and had a chance to leave. I mean, Youngstown is a place where, gosh,
Mhm.
over almost 60% of the population has left since the steel mills closed. Um, and they were choosing to stay. Not all were choosing, some had to, but all this work was being done by this new generation. And that energy was kind of reshaping the town. And I was really curious about like just what that would look like over time. Um,
Mhm.
and for me personally, as a journalist, I often just parachute into these places for a few days and then I leave and I tell my story and that's it. And everyone gets reduced to these, issues and sound bites. And I just really wanted to stay myself and to get to know people and to see what change and um, resilience. I know that term gets thrown around a lot, but what resilience
Mhm.
really looks like on the ground in these towns. And
Yeah.
that's so kind of what initially drew me to Youngstown.
Yeah, and I was really struck in watching this film in terms of a narrative choice. I want to talk to you about a few of the choices you made in making it, but it's not a film that is organized around a conflict exactly. Like they're not a set of actors that are in conflict with each other, which is what I think you often see in these stories about city revitalization efforts. Neighborhood conflicts, another Ohio documentary, Flag Wars, for example, obviously American Factory, in terms of um, sort of conflicts and cultures and relationship to sort of work culture. There's neighborhood conflicts, and so that's not the story you're telling here. And I was just wondering if that was a conscious choice, and because it does give a different feeling than a lot of these kinds of city documentaries.
Yes, I mean, that was definitely a conscious choice. I wanted to create kind of this poetic journey, and portrait of this town and these people. and what they were doing, what their daily lives felt like, and kind of even just sort of reflecting my own experience of staying and over 3 years and seeing their lives change. And it was also just stylistically for me, just a huge departure from what I usually do, which is to write a lot of narration and give a lot of context and talk about the conflicts and the pros and the cons. This was going to be just something, I wanted to create something different, where you really felt immersed in this town. And it's a small town. I mean, you walk around and you just see people all the time that you meet. We would run into Julius at the little jazz club downtown, or Bernie at City Hall, just when we were walking around. And so I wanted to kind of reflect the feeling of the town in the way the stories wove together to create this kind of tapestry, of this place that I think is very representative of where we are, in America today. Um, yeah.
Yeah, because it did make me think about the kind of story or the way I tell stories about my hometown, and about Dayton and sort of the decline that started in the late 70s, and as industry started to leave. And it was, well, there were sort of some references, for example, like Black factory workers when they came into uh, when they worked in the factories, and sort of the racial conflict. I mean, there are things, there's a story about that. There's also a story about the sort of more affluent enclaves that sort of surround Youngstown, like, what is it, Poland Springs, like there's something like that. Like there's like Hubbard, there's some places that are very close that have more money. And I always think about, growing up, I thought about Dayton as often in conflict with suburbs, and like as suburbs as sort of these kind of parasitic entities, to me. So it was interesting to me to watch this film that was just very sweet in looking at all the community solidarity. It was just really a different perspective than I usually see.
Yeah, and that is similar with Youngstown too. I mean, it's very different from, yeah, exactly, all the surrounding suburbs. And that's where a lot of people who do have jobs, they live in the suburbs.
Mhm.
And so, like, for instance, the nonprofit is really trying to bring people back into the
Mhm.
city and just make these neighborhoods a place where, people want to live. And yeah, so, um, one of the other things that drew me to Youngstown was in that first reporting trip that I went on. Tiffany was showing me the different houses at different stages that they were working on.
Mhm.
Um, and I thought that could be a really amazing spine for a documentary, to see one house over time change back into a home, for a family. And to me, it was they're so symbolic of Youngstown and of a lot of towns. I mean, when you walk into these homes, I mean, it's heartbreaking. I mean, you
Mhm.
see so much love and so much loss, um and then to watch that transform again. I mean, that is, to me, the story, or the potential story, of Youngstown and many other, um post-industrial towns.
Y-
um
You have these houses with all this, like these good bones, and I have a weakness for old houses that are, money sucks. I'm doing this from one right now. Um, but yes, I mean, I also live in the city now, St. Louis. If you were here, you would see it's also a city that has a lot of empty houses, in particular neighborhoods, but then there are also these tensions between more affluent neighborhoods and ones that are not. But you have just these good bones of houses, and this question that is posed at one point in your film, where someone's like, it makes you wonder, like, who was here, right? Like, and when you see this detritus in these homes when they enter them, were they the people who own the home, who were renting the home? Were they squatters? The kids stuff that's left, and you just don't know. Was that interesting to you, even the thought of trying to track down histories of some of these houses, or no?
we did. I mean, so we ended up having, although we filmed many houses, the Pine View house became sort of our main character. And
Mhm.
we tried to find the, previous homeowners who left, and I sent letters to where I thought they lived. And I thought, I mean, I really tried. And, it's I mean, it's like really hard when you've lost your
Yeah.
house.
Yes.
and they did not want to be a part of that. I mean, they didn't reach out back to me. And so, um, and that was, I mean, we talked to the neighbors about it a little bit, and, about who she was. And at the end of the day, we decided not to put it in because to protect her privacy. But I think not having that story in, I think a lot of people can either know someone or can relate or fill in the blanks to what could have happened to that person. I mean, it's not, we had the foreclosure crisis, not that long ago, and we could be on the brink of having another one, after this pandemic is over. So, yeah. So that's kind of how we ended up going about that and dealing with that part of the story. So.
Well, speaking to the question or the idea that people could relate to this by like knowing people like this or knowing stories like this, one of the features of your documentary, particularly earlier in the documentary, is this archival home movie footage that you have, right? And so it's not tied to particular people. It's just you have this archival footage, and I'm sort of curious about where you got the home movies from, and about the decision to insert that in various places in the documentary, and what you understood yourself as doing with that move.
So those home movies are from people who live in Youngstown. We reach out to different people and they gave us their movies. And then some of it is, or, just straight up archival footage that we found of Youngstown in its heyday. And, as I was saying about having these houses be sort of the symbolic of Youngstown, the first time you see that archival footage, or actually, no, there's some in the beginning, is in this house. And that was sort of the moment that I was hoping viewers would make that connection, that this house is full of so many memories and they're haunting. Um, and there is that loss. There is, all of that loss in these homes and in this city. And so that's what we were really trying to show. And also there's a tension between, for instance, like Ian's parents and Ian, and because that generation, they remember the heyday, and then they had to live through seeing their way of life and their town crumble around them. Julius, Ian, Tiffany, all of the rest of them, they grew up when it was already bottomed out. They grew up in that rubble. And so there is a different mindset because of that. And I think that's also one of the reasons why Ian, Tiffany, and Julius can kind of see a different future for the town. They're not as beholden to those memories and haunted and traumatized. And so that was also why we kind of wanted to weave in some of those moments of archival footage and also photographs, looking at the past. Yeah, so it was sort of an artistic choice and thematic to sort of boost up the sort of themes of the documentary and the tension between past and present and future.
And there was some parts though that they did have memories of places that still deteriorated while they were growing up. I mean, certainly with the school, for example, right?
Yeah.
And that's the hard story, I think, of deterioration in these cities. So yes, there was Black Tuesday, right, in 1977, like this moment when 50,000 jobs were lost, right, in one moment. But then it just becomes this decline for a long time, and then more businesses leave, and places you used to go for entertainment are gone. And it just, you see these, like all these spaces downtown, and you have a number of moments in your documentary where you see that, so here is a place that this is what this place looks like now, and this was like an image when it was sort of in its heyday. And the ways in which these sort of empty businesses and buildings are really painful to walk around that space if you have like any memory, even if it's as a kid. And for me, a lot of it was sort of as a kid, and it was a slow deterioration over time, right? So like it took about 15 to 20 years, right? And so what do you make then of the sort of the prospects? So there is all this hope, and I found it really interesting that the main conflict, if there is an adversary, is this absence of industry, right? It's about 50 minutes in before someone says, but where are the jobs? Like, you can work on the homes and you can do all those things, but the industry is still not there, which is like an ongoing struggle for the city. And so what did the people you talked to say about that or think about that? And what are your thoughts about that, about the city's prospects given that challenge?
Um, it's a huge challenge. I mean, they also just lost the GM, the Lordstown factory too. Um, and it's something that they've been struggling for decades. Um, but things, there are jobs there. People are working, and it's a much smaller population. I mean, there's the healthcare system there, and there have been improvements, but it is the big problem that's holding Youngstown back. And but at the end of the day, I think like the scene where Ian's older brother comes back, and he's sort of talking about like there's all of these huge issues. I mean, the system is broken, um, and it's overwhelming. And Ian is just like, yeah, there are these big issues, but that's not going to stop me from doing what I can do. Um, and that is sort of what the documentary is about. Yes, we have these huge, overwhelming issues, and even with our one little political mention, our Trump mention, it's like, we're going to bring all these jobs back. And, there's all of these issues that are facing these towns, but what can we do? And that's what the documentary is really about. And it's not looking at these huge sweeping changes. It's looking at one house at a time, one job at a time, and also just bringing some humanity to these cities. Again, like a lot of, like even my job, I was sent there because Youngstown is the poster child for, post-industrial blight. But there are people there, and this was a chance to like really show what their lives are like. There's a story that I like to tell that's, years ago, I produced an interview with a Somalian refugee, and he was telling us all about having to flee and getting on the last flight out of Mogadishu, and chaos and war. And then he had recently gone back years later, and we were like, what did you find there, expecting him to say, oh, the chaos and the violence there is terrible. And instead he's like, well, I found people going to the beach, falling in love, getting married, life goes on. And I kept thinking about that conversation with him. Not that Somalia and Youngstown are the same, but they share these, very tough to shake perceptions. And so that was what was really important to me to show in this film too, is life going on. But yeah, those are huge issues that are not going to go away, like with the job. And we still do not know what the full economic fallout is going to be from this pandemic. And these towns are extremely vulnerable. And, I recently talked to Ian's parents after they saw the film, and they're just it's like they feel just really depressed right now. They've made these strides and now they've gone backwards. But Ian and Tiffany and Joe, like, they're still really positive. I mean, they're still working as hard as they can, and working even harder now than they were before. So, yeah.
And I noticed back to the idea of conflict, the generational conflict, his parents really wanted him to leave. I think like he has a window, he's, skilled and talented, and they want him, it almost seems like they want him to get out at some point, as opposed to staying in Youngstown. So that was sort of, kind of heartbreaking to see, despite, how proud they clearly are of all he's doing, that they feel like he has more of a future if he's not there.
Yeah, I mean, and Ian had mentioned to me that, out of all of his close friends in his group, out of all the friends who did go to college, he's the only one who stayed in Youngstown. They all left. And that is, yeah, and his parents still, that they said it was really hard to watch because it showed that their continual struggle that they've had, whether to go or stay. And, but they're also really fiercely proud of Youngstown too, and everything that Youngstown has. And So yeah, it's also something for me personally that um, it's just very different from my own background. You know, I'm the child of immigrants. My dad was a street kid in India and was brought over as a foster child. My mom, you know, came from the Philippines to be a nurse here. And so that idea and that connection to home, I just never really had. I don't know if I just inherited in my DNA or whatever. And so I was really drawn to that idea that they're so, these are people, you know, even Julius's family, they come from generations have lived in Youngstown, and yeah, and they're fiercely loyal to Youngstown. And so I was just curious to see what that really looks like and why. Like, why stay when you have the choice to leave?
Yeah, those of us who move around a lot, it is a different experience, and I do envy it in some ways. Those long-term, in a lot of ways, actually, those long-term family and community connections that people continue to have. And you said you went to school in Ohio. Where did you go to school?
I went to Oberlin
Oh, okay.
College,
Nice.
yeah,
Which is
and then I
cool.
went back and
Mhm.
studied at Antioch. They have a documentary institute there that I went to,
Mhm.
also in Yellow Springs.
Yeah. So beautiful places. And I think in also showing like the nature walk there, and as you said, like trying to um, shake up the sort of national image or discourse about these spaces, right? Um, and one of the things that I did appreciate, and I was curious about your choice of subjects for the documentary, because being from the Midwest, I often feel as if people act as if there are no Black people in the Midwest, like that there were, but Youngstown as a place is probably about evenly split,
Yeah, it
demographically,
is. It's
right?
50, roughly 50%.
Yeah, and it's not something when people talk about Main Street and lost jobs and factory workers, like it's Black workers are very rarely pictured in these stories, but it's been so damaging in relationship to like building a Black middle class, and sort of it was so important with companies like GM in building the Black middle class. So I was just sort of curious about how you chose your subjects, and if you were attentive to or thinking about like wanting to show like the racial diversity of the city in that way.
Yes, definitely. That was definitely my intent. We really wanted to show the Black experience for exactly what you were just saying. And, you know, we actually met Julius at that city hall meeting. Ian had brought us there, and, you know, I just started talking to him, and he was just so open about his life and, you know, his history and the mistakes he made, and so giving, that and he's just so great to work with and interview. And um, so we were really happy to include him in the documentary. But that was definitely like we were looking for those stories. And like with even within that city hall meeting, it is very reflective of Youngstown. It is very mixed, Black
Mhm.
and white. In fact, I mean, there are spaces in the film where it's very segregated,
Mhm.
but the moments where the community comes together or the neighborhood comes together and they want to work on some issues, like in that city hall meeting, at the neighborhood meeting, you see all of Youngstown in those meetings. And that was important for us to include those moments, but also to include the moments where it is not that way. I think one of the more kind of controversial, I'm curious what your reaction was to this scene, is the when Tiffany goes to church with Arthur
Mhm.
and his brothers. And that is, um, I grew up in the church, and our family was like one of the only Brown families in my church. So I'm kind of used to that, what that looks like. But um, you know, that's a scene where it triggers very different reactions from I've had like a whole gamut of reactions and unexpected reactions from people about that scene, and what they take away from that scene. Anyway, I'm curious what your reaction was.
Well, I mean, and it's when I the scene when I was first watching Tiffany and the kids, I said, well, is she their foster parent? I was trying to figure out what the relationship here was, and it seemed it was more sort of a big sister kind of situation, right? Where she had the kids sort of briefly and had community with them. And I know, I've known in my life a lot of people who have had that relationship with kids and of a different race. And it was, it was good to see, what their home life was, but also to see that it was how it was like a struggle, as we often see. And this crosses racial boundaries, particularly given the more recent drug crisis, right? Which I know hit Youngstown really hard as well. But it is those, it's a question. And I think that, in thinking about segregation in spaces like this and community responsibility or support of racial community responsibility, or sort of taking care of, various members and vulnerable members of their community, I think that probably those kids need as much support as they can get in any place they can get it, right? So
Yeah.
and they do still have like Black family connections, but so I wasn't bothered by it, but I could tell I did wonder if some people might pause over it.
Yeah.
Um
Some people they just have an allergic reaction to church in general, or there's a lot of things in there that.
yeah, well, yeah, I'm
But
not.
her relationship with them though is so. I mean, she's known these kids for a very long time, since they were very young, and she's actually taking them to the beach for the holidays because they've never seen the ocean before.
Yeah.
I mean, she's sticking around. It's not like she's flying into some foreign country getting pictures taken and leaving. It's
it's very clear. Well, and certainly, I mean, that's interesting that people, just because they don't want to see church, but I mean, there are very deep rooted religious communities all over the country, but certainly in the Midwest, and there are a lot of churches, and that's a foundational part of community. And so it almost would be weird to me to tell the story and you don't see a church at all, particularly when you're dealing with something like housing, because housing, because so often church groups provide resources and support for low-income housing in communities. So that's just a reality of how housing is worked.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
And
it's definitely it's a big part of Tiffany's life, and we wanted to show that. I mean, that is her motivation for doing a lot of the work that she does. It is rooted in her faith.
Yeah, and I think that seeing again, I mean, I was just really struck by how this was, I won't say it's utopian, but it is such a sweet film about community and support, and what you imagine can be in various ways. And seeing these nice trajectories, and Julius is getting married to this lovely woman at the end, and seeing this like gorgeous house that a single mom gets. I mean, those are wonderful things. So if you had the film to do over, are there things that you wish you could have included, or would have included, or you would have added?
I kind of wish we could have. I mean, the world is so different now, and in the middle of this pandemic, like I wish we maybe were filming right now to see how they're faring, and what that looks like. And yeah, I think like that would be my one thing, is that I wish we could have just kept filming longer. But I think, like, in reaction to what you were saying about it being, very hopeful film, that was definitely my intention. I was, for me personally, I've been just so overwhelmed and feeling jaded by everything, just all the global and national issues. And I love stories that are showing these, like, almost like these hyper local community groups who are, figuring out what they need and what their problems are, and it's not coming from above, and it's they're doing the work. And I love highlighting those kinds of stories and those successes. So it was definitely intentional to make this. I mean, not to kind of also just hide all the obstacles. I mean, there are these these obstacles hanging over them. Um, and we wanted to include those moments kind of abruptly, like when the SWAT team comes and raids the house. I mean, like those things would just happen while we were filming. Like we would just drive up and there would be a SWAT team, and it was important to show those moments, because that is the context that they're doing this work in. But I really did want it to be an inspiring story, and to leave people thinking, oh yeah, what can I do? What can I be doing right now? Despite all this other stuff that's happening, despite this election and global, all of these other issues, and to really think like, what can I do for my neighbor? What can I do for myself? What can I do in my own neighborhood?
Well, yeah, I was definitely expecting to be depressed, like for it to be another depressing Ohio story when I watched it, and was really pleased that it actually filled me with some unexpected joy. So thank you for that. And thank you for the conversation. I hope this film spreads widely.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.